Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Juliane Kempfield. I'm the director at Deutsches Haus at NYU. It's my great, great pleasure to welcome you to this very, very special event, speaking about and reading from Paul Celan's Breath Turn into Timestead, wonderfully translated and provided with great commentary by Pierre Joris. And Pierre Joris will first be in conversation and then later speak with Paul Auster. And we're very thrilled to have you here and to present this event. And thank you for coming on this rainy night. I remember quite distinctly when I first came across Celan's poetry as a young reader. Celan's words had a very powerful, disquieting, and I would like to say, lasting impact on my understanding of literature, as I had never quite encountered poems like his before. I was initially frustrated by, after many readings, not being able to reach what I thought should be a clearly definable interpretation. But eventually I also noticed how this lack of, let me call it, interpretive closure meant that these poems stayed with me, that they returned to me or I returned to them in unexpected ways many years later. And I just wish I had known back then what Pierre Joris remarks upon in his excellent commentary, and please let me quote, that to read a poem is always at least a double movement, the systole of absolute attentiveness brought to bear on the text, and the diastole of letting your mind move from every word in the text out into the world of both books and experience. I think this is marvelously put, and I was very touched when I discovered this in your commentary. Professor Ulrich Beer was supposed to give the introduction tonight, but unfortunately, at the very last minute, he came down with a terrible cold and in fact lost his voice. So he sends his regrets, but he can't be here tonight, so I'll introduce our distinguished speakers instead of him. Pierre Joris is the author of some 50 books, including poetry, essays, translations, and anthologies. Most recently, he published Meditations on the Stations of Mansour al-Hallaj, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, and the anthology Poems for the Millennium, Volume 4, the University of California Book of North African Literature. In 2005, he received the PEN Award for Poetry in Translation and for his translation of Celan's Lichtzwang, Light Duress. Paul Auster is the best-selling, award-winning author of 16 novels, including Sunset Park, Invisible, Men in the Dark, The Brooklyn Follies, The Book of Illusions, and the New York Trilogy. His work has been translated into more than 41 languages. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. And now please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Pierre Joris and Paul Auster.
I assume everyone here has read some Paul Celan, or am I wrong? I don't want to make any assumptions, actually. I'm just trying to figure out where we should begin the conversation. Maybe we should begin at the beginning. It's always good to ask first questions, I suppose. Then I'm going to ask Pierre, when did you first encounter Paul Celan's work? What effect did it have on you, and when did you decide you wanted to translate it?
Okay. When I was 15, in high school in Luxembourg, Otto Scholer, my German teacher, brought in a peripatetic, wandering scholar who would give readings of poetry. And he read various contemporary German poets of that Nachkriegsliteratur, you know. And this was all very interesting. And then all of a sudden, he read Todesvogel. And my hair stood on end. It was kind of maybe the one genuine mystical experience I had. And what it did it made me realize that there was a use of language that was different from anything I'd known, be it spoken language, be it written language, be it literature that we had studied, novels, whatever. And this thing was called poetry. And this was sort of absolute to me. And that is the moment that, at that moment, I changed. I kind of decided that this would become what I wanted to do with my life. I couldn't decide it completely at that moment. In Luxembourg at 15, you don't do such things. But from that moment on, I knew there was something out there that I was, that I wanted to do. And a few years later, after some zigzagging, trying to study medicine but quitting, and to write. I figured I'd come to America, and because I wanted to write in English.
Can you explain why?
Yes.
This is part of what I wanted to ask you after. So let's talk about this question of being an English language writer from a country where you didn't grow up speaking English, and even translating other languages into English, which is fascinating.
It's the one thing that Celan would absolutely despise in what I'm doing. He's the man who said you can only write a poem in the mother tongue. But that was his specific psychic problem, too. In Luxembourg, we speak Luxembourgish, which is, it's a language. Used to be called a dialect, but it's a Mosellan Frankish language. But we were never taught to write it. After the Second World War, eventually they decided, well, either the French or the Germans run over us, so we should better make this the national language, put together a dictionary and so on. But we spoke it at home. But my schooling was in German and in French, bilingually. So you wind up at the end of high school not knowing either of the languages completely. I had put English, studying English in high school too, and English was somewhere the language that was the liveliest. I mean, we talked about it in the car. You mentioned Wenders and rock and roll. I mentioned, oh, I used to drive home to listen to rock and roll on the radio. My grandmother had a movie house, and I would go there for free, wonderful, watch Westerns before all. And Westerns were wonderful to learn English because John Wayne never used many words. And so you could learn it. And they were not dubbed because this was the Benelux countries, so they had two subtitles, Dutch and French. So they had to be in English. And so I learned from that. And then I came across poetry. When I began looking at literature, I came across Ginsberg. I bought Howl in a weird bookshop that was only open 6 months before the bishop closed it. And Borges's Naked Lunch. And I found a copy of On the Road on a beach in Spain. A young honeymoon couple kind of got very busy and they left. And they left a book there and I picked it up. It was On the Road. And so somehow all of this made English a very attractive language. And when I was in Paris and I dropped out of medical school, I moved into Shakespeare and Company. And Shakespeare and Company is an English language library. And so I had to make a choice. I had started to write in German a little bit. I'd written a bit in French. I didn't like them. Essentially, the problematic of German literature post-war in the 50s was not mine, being from Luxembourg. And I was not interested in what the French were doing. I thought the French had done great stuff before the war. The Surrealists were major and so on. I went back further, the 19th century. But I was totally not interested. I found nothing in... And so you're foolish at 18, you know, you think, well, if I have to write in a foreign language anyway, given that I can't write in Luxembourg, why not write in the fourth language?
Okay, so you defined yourself within yourself as an English language writer, a multilingual speaker, but an English language writer. Okay, let's go back to Paul Celan. So you've heard the first poem when you're 15. When did you first read it? Have a book in your hands with Celan's poems in them?
Relatively quickly. There was a very good anthology, the DTV anthology of World War II German poetry. Kind of nearly the equivalent of our Donald Allen anthology. It was that eye-opening. And then I went out and bought my first Celan books in Luxembourg. And I bought either in September of '67 when it came out, just before I came to New York, the first volume I translated, namely Atemwende, that had just come out. It came out right there. Or I got it around Christmas, or my parents sent it, I can't remember exactly. But I had it by the end of '67 at Bard College and had started translating. No, I started translating in the fall because at Shakespeare & Company there was a marvelous magazine called Two Cities. And the man who ran that, who is an Antillean psychiatrist poet, Jean Fanchette, asked me to do some translations for the magazine. And I offered him some translations from of Celan.
But here, let me interrupt just for a second. You've moved from a moment when you weren't translating to a moment when you were. But I want to know how that transition took place. What was it about the work that made you, young, aspiring writer that you were, say to yourself, I want to start translating this into English? How did you come to that decision?
Because I needed to learn to write in English.
And you think translating a German poet is going to
would help doing that, would help doing two things. Translation, I've written it elsewhere, is the closest reading you can give a poem, right? And so Celan needs close readings because it is a difficult poet in that sense. So that notion of translation was with me from early on. At one level I thought, well, what can I do wanting to be a poet? Maybe I can make a living. I know poetry is not bringing me as a translator. And I have those other languages, so let me try to do that. And I did for some years after that towards French. I made a living translating towards French. But what interested me most really was translating towards English those writers that I thought of as the major figures, and Celan was core.
So let me rephrase it just a tiny bit. Was Celan the first poet you translated?
Yes.
Yeah. You see, I'm interested. Pierre and I are just about the same age. And I went through similar experiences with French poets right around that time, at the age of 19, 20. And the leap into the desire to want to translate a poet is very different from the pleasure of reading a poet. There's something much more intense and passionate about it. You know, you're really giving up chunks of every day in order to try to wrestle with the work of another person, which is, for a young person, a rather bizarre thing to do. So I'm just trying to understand your mental and emotional state when you got involved in doing this. Did you feel you were learning things?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, remember, that is a time when there was no talk yet of creative writing classes or anything of that order. So as a young writer, the idea was really to, in my mind at least, to apprentice myself to the most formidable writer I could find and try to discover how that writer did put together those poems, right? And by translating them, I had to take them apart, and that would teach me a lot about the art, the craft of writing itself.
Now, at that point, when you started the translations, did you know anything about Celan himself? Did you have any idea about his background, the trajectory that had led him from Romania to Vienna to Paris, the changing of his name, the experience of the family during World War II, the fact that he was a Jew? Did any of this register, or you were just in love with the words on the page?
The fact that he was a Jew registered because obviously the first poem that we all came to was the Todesfuge, right? And so the little potted biographical notes at the end of the anthologies that I got gave me 10 lines about him. But that was it. There wasn't much else. And so from the fall of '67, when I moved to New York, I couldn't either find out more in terms of checking the German newspapers, you know, and that was a time before you could go online and do that. When I started translating Atemwende in '68 at Bard College as my thesis, my senior project, as they call it there, the only Sekundärliteratur, the only texts on Celan, on Atemwende, were 2 reviews. That was all there was. And there was a couple older in German, from German newspapers. You know, that was it. There was, on Atemwende specifically, there were 2 book reviews.
And there was almost nothing in English.
Almost.
Right? Wasn't there
nothing. Jerry
Glenn, when he wrote a book on Celan? When was that?
I think that's a bit later. That's early 70s.
Yes.
You know.
Now, okay, here's the question then. Paul Celan committed suicide in, I think it was April of 1970.
Yeah.
So you were involved translating his work, but as you say, didn't know that much about him. Did you hear about his death when it happened or not?
I heard about it because by that time I was back in Europe. I moved back I was in New York, but I had gone back for several months in late '69, and I thought in Paris I would try to see if I could meet him. So I talked somehow with people, and clearly this was not a good idea. And I dropped the idea. And I think I had already also talked about him with Jerry Rothenberg, who I met in late '69, and who was kind of the first American translator who had done the Todesfuge in that wonderful little square book from City Lights called New German Poetry that he published in about '57 or so. So with Jerry, I had already talked about Celan, given that I had translated him. And in New York, I was talking with people. I mean, Robert Kelly at Bard had been my advisor on this. Clayton Eshelman and Caterpillar magazine wanted to publish some of the translations. That didn't happen for a number of reasons. But there was one really knew very little. He was a very mysterious figure. And it is only in the '70s that one began to come across more secondary literature. The essays came out, serious work began being done on him. But of course, then it never stopped, so that now there is no way of reading. It's 6,000 plus items.
Yes, well, I mean, the reputation keeps growing to the point I would say now he's probably the most respected European post-war poet in any language.
Yes, I would say.
Yeah.
I think so too.
Yeah. Now, I first came across his work because I don't read German in translation, and it was the book translated by Joachim Nurgerschau. I think the book came out in '70, and I think I came across it in '71. So that was my first encounter with Celan, which was an explosive one, not unlike the description we heard in the beginning of this evening. He's a poet so unlike any other poet that you're blasted to pieces when you read it. I happened to have moved then in early '71 to Paris, and I was translating French poets, many of whom, or several of whom, were friends of Paul Celan, in particular André Dubuchet and Jacques Dupin, who worked on the board of the magazine L'Éphémère with Celan. Celan translated both of them into German. Dubuchet translated Celan into French. And they were very involved with Celan personally, making great efforts during those late years when Celan was cracking up, having breakdowns, trying to get him psychiatric care. So I heard a lot of these stories, but for me, these were only stories. I came just too late to have encountered him myself. And so my whole time, all those years in Paris, were sort of, there was the shadow of Paul Celan hanging over everything. I was telling Pierre in the car, Dubuchet, who became a very close friend of mine, invited me to go on a go to a demonstration with him in Paris in the spring of '71. Tens of thousands of people out there. I can't remember at all what the protest was about now, but he said, you know, during '68, May '68, Dubuchet said, Celan and I walked the streets of Paris a lot, and we were together constantly, and every time he saw a black flag, he was thrilled. It made him so happy. All right, so let's pursue this. So when did you first publish a volume of Celan's work?
Many, many years later. So Atemwende was finished in the spring of '69. I published some poems in magazines over the next couple of years. I moved to England in '72, and there a publisher was interested in publishing the book, but couldn't get the rights. And this not getting the rights went on 20 years. My first volume of Celan came out in '95 from Sun and Moon Press. So that's the spread from '69 to '95. And then Douglas Messerly wanted to do the 3 books. By that time, I had done 3 full volumes.
So you done. So this is a remarkable thing that this man has the passion to translate these poems, books of poems, volumes of poetry, without any hope of having them published. So this is an extraordinary act of love, it seems to me, that is rare in the annals of literature, really.
Well, you know, I call it, with Maurice Blanchot's word, it's the unrepayable debt. You know, it's what Celan did to me by giving me, in a way, my life's work to do. And so it is simply that I feel I owe him this. Mm-hmm. So I keep doing it.
So by the time the first volume was published in the 90s, you had already translated 3 or 4 by that point. And then, of course, you went on. Now, let's talk a bit about the current volume, the book that is, I think, being published today or tomorrow, which is a mighty book. It's an enormous book, hundreds and hundreds of poems. And it's the entire second half of Celan's career as a poet.
Which is a bit longer, in fact, than the first half. Mm-hmm. There was these stories that Celan late was falling silent, couldn't write anymore, only these tiny, hermetic little poems. And in fact, if you look at the work, from Atemwende on, that second part of the work, he's writing nearly daily poems. He's writing the bigger books. He's, rather than publishing 1 volume every 4 years, as he had done in the 20 years before, he's now publishing a volume nearly every year and a half, you know, until the posthumous ones come out. So there is an immense work that happens from '65 onwards, the last 5 years of his life, really.
So for you, when were most of these translations done? When did you come up with the idea of this big book? Because I know you've done the early work, but then this. How did this come about?
Well, once Douglas Messerly published 3 volumes, and they were supposed to come out in very quick succession, in 3 years, and then they were supposed to be a kind of all 3 volumes in 1 box set, and this never happened. It took 8 years to get the 3 books out. And meanwhile, I had gone on and worked on the next books. So I had more and more work there. I'd publish in magazines. And then I thought, well, I do want to put together a collected late poetry. This seemed to be an important project simply because the early work is the better known work. It is the work that is more accessible. There's various translations of it are out. And my sense was that the later books need to be done completely, not as selections, because the mode of writing in those later books is different. They're not individual poems somehow gathered into a volume, you know, with titles. They become sequences, serial constructions, cycles of poems, so that you can see one of those smaller poems as nearly a sentence in a much longer discourse that goes by cycles, so 4, 5, 6 cycles per volume. And it didn't make sense anymore. Michael Hamburger once said about Atemwende, well, I translated those poems I could understand. And that just didn't make sense to me. I said, what does understanding mean here? I will never say, oh, I understood this poem, right? No, I've worked on this poem. I made a translation of it. And every time I go back, or very often I go back, I find something new in it. But the important thing was to do the complete volumes as such. And then it seemed to me that, well, the late work is such a massive opus and so very specific in terms of its poetics, in terms of where it stands in the late 20th century, it would be worthwhile to put it all together into one edition.
So you worked on it for, just give us an idea, I guess from the mid-90s on, right? Is that, or
well, the mid-90s,
2000?
Yes, on and off. In fact, all the poems were translated by the very early 20th century. A couple, there's a little cycle that was translated later. But then 3-4 years ago, I took everything up again when FSG took on the book. It was marvelous that, you know, Jonathan Galassi was totally enthusiastic and said, yes, we want to do this book. And that gave me a lot of energy to just sit down and put it together and add the commentary section.
Because the commentary, I want to recommend this book to everybody because the commentaries are very lengthy. It's an extraordinary study of the poems. Plus, the introduction is, I think, about 60 or 70 pages long in itself, which is also extremely informative. And I think Pierre's insights about Celan's work and the nature of the German are so penetrating and helpful for anybody trying to pick his way through this very, very difficult but extremely exciting poetry. And I think if there's, is there anything more you want to say? Because I actually want to sit back and listen to you read. I mean, we could go on talking about this, but I think perhaps the stage has been set. I think everyone here has an idea of what the project was, what it is, and so I'm going to turn it over to you now and let you read. Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Pierre.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. I also would like to thank the Deutsches Haus for putting this on, and of course Jonathan Galassi and everybody at FSG who is involved in the project, you know, Christopher Richards and Jill McLaughlin, of course. It's very difficult to thank people who helped me for 45 years. I don't think I'd remember them all, or we would be here till tomorrow morning. But let me mention also Eric Celan, Paul Celan's son, who has been very gracious and very helpful in terms of the question of rights, in terms of all of working with these materials, and Bertrand Badiou, who is the specialist, who is the helper of Eric, and who is at the ENS, at the École Normale Supérieure, has the Celan post, and he teaches one seminar every year on Celan, and he has all the Celan. He is kind of the Celan. And I would like to thank, in a way, posthumously, Gisèle Celan-Lestrange, because meeting her, given that I never could meet Paul Celan, was very important to me. And she became a friend, and I learned a lot of, you know, what I didn't know, what you, for example, learned from those French friends when you're in France then, when I was already on Anglo-Saxon territory. I learned from her later on in the early 80s. And Petra Christina Hard at Zuurkamp, who has been very useful and helpful over the years. Very, very wonderful person to work with. Nicole Perafit, who has put up for a quarter century now with my near daily Celan despairs and so on, and who's putting this visual show together. We put together a show a couple of years ago, a very complicated show that you may catch at some other point as only visual. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with a little reading from Atemwende. And we have Celan's voice on this. And so the first dozen poems that open Atemwende, it's also important to read a sequence of poems to get that sense that these things are sequential to some extent. We will read in sequence, Celan's voice first and then my translation.
Du darfst mich getrost mit Schnee bewirten, so oft ich Schulter an Schulter mit dem Maulbeerbaum ging durch den Sommer, schrie sein jüngstes Blatt.
You may confidently serve me snow, as often as shoulder to shoulder with the mulberry tree I strode through summer, its youngest leaf shrieked.
Von Ungeträumtem geätzt wirft das schlaflos durchwanderte Brotland den Lebensberg auf. Aus seiner Krume knetest du neu unsere Namen, die ich ein deinem gleichendes Aug an jedem der Finger abtaste nach einer Stelle, durch die ich mich zu dir hindurchwachen kann, die helle Hungerkerze im Mund.
By the undreamt etched, the sleeplessly wandered through breadland casts up the life mountain. From its crumb you knead anew our names, which I, an eye similar to yours on each finger, probe for a place through which I can wake myself toward you, the bright hunger candle in mouth.
In die Rillen der Himmelsmünze im Türspalt presst du das Wort, dem ich entrollte, als ich mit bebenden Fäusten das Dach über uns abtrug, Schiefer um Schiefer, Silbe um Silbe, dem Kupferschimmer der Bettelschale dort oben zulieb.
Into the furrows of the heaven's coin in the door crack, you pressed the word from which I rolled. When I, with trembling fists, the roof over us dismantled, slate for slate, syllable for syllable, for the copper glimmer of the begging cup's sake up there.
In den Flüssen nördlich der Zukunft warf ich das Netz aus, das du zögernd beschwerst mit von Steinen geschriebenen Schatten.
In the rivers north of the future, I cast the net, which you hesitantly wait with shadows, stones wrote.
Vor dein spätes Gesicht, alleingängerisch zwischen auf mich verwandelnden Nächten, kam etwas zu stehen, das schon einmal bei uns war, unberührt von Gedanken.
Before your late face, a loner wandering between nights that change me too, something came to stand, which was with us once already, untouched by thoughts.
Wie Schwermutsschnellen hindurch, am blanken Wundenspiegel vorbei. Da werden die 40 entrindeten Lebensstämme geflößt. Einzige Gegenschwimmerin, du zählst sie, berührst sie alle.
Down melancholy's rapids, past the blank wound mirror, there the 40 stripped life trees are rafted. Single counter swimmer, you count them, touch them all.
Wege im Schattengebräch deiner Hand. Aus der Vierfingerfurche wühl ich mir den versteinerten Segen.
Path in the shadow break of your hand. From the four-finger furrow, I root up the petrified blessing.
Weißgrau ausgeschachteten steilen Gefühls. Landeinwärts hierher verwehter Strandhafer bläst Sandmuster über den Rauch von Brunnengesängen. Ein Ohr abgetrennt lauscht. Ein Aug in Streifen geschnitten wird all dem gerecht.
White gray of shafted, steep feeling. Land inward, hither drifted sea oats blow sand patterns over the smoke of well chance. An ear, severed, listens. An eye, cut in strips, does justice to all this.
Mit erdwärts gesungenen Masten fahren die Himmelwracks. In dieses Holzlied beißt du dich fest mit den Zähnen. Du bist der liedfeste Wimpel.
With masts sunk earthward, the sky wrecks drive. On to the wood song, you hold fast with your teeth. You are the song-fast pennant.
Beim Hagelkorn, im brandigen Maiskolben, daheim, den späten, den harten Novembersternen gehorsam, in den Herzfaden die Gespräche der Würmer geknüpft, eine Sehne, von der deine Pfeilschrift schwirrt, schütze.
Next to the hailstone and the mildewed corn cob, home to the late, the hard November stars obedient. In the heart thread, the knit of worm talk, a bowstring from which your arrow script whirs, archer.
Stehen im Schatten des Wundenmals in der Luft, für niemand und nichts stehen, unerkannt, für dich allein, mit allem, was darin Raum hat, auch ohne Sprache.
To stand in the shadow of the stigma in the air, standing for no one and nothing, unrecognized, for you alone, with all that has room in it, even without language.
Dein vom Wachen stößiger Traum, mit der 12-mal schraubenförmig in sein Horn gekerbten Wortspur, der letzte Stoß, den er führt. Die in der senkrechten, schmalen Tagschlucht nach oben stakende Fähre. Sie setzt Wundgelesenes über.
Your dream butting from the watch, with the word spoor carved 12 times helically into its horn, the last butt it delivers. In the vertical narrow day gorge, the upward poling ferry, it carries sore readings over.
Mit den Verfolgten in spätem, unverschwiegenem, strahlendem Bund. Das Morgenlot übergoldet, heftet sich dir an die mitschwörende, mitschürfende, mitschreibende Verse.
With the persecuted in late, unsilenced, radiating league, the morning plum, gilded, hafts itself to your co-swearing, co-scratching, co-writing heel.
Fadensonnen, Fadensonnen über der grauschwarzen Ödnis. Ein baumhoher Gedanke greift sich den Lichtturm. Es sind noch Lieder zu singen, jenseits der Menschen.
Thread suns above the gray-black wastes. A tree-high thought grasps the light tone. There are still songs to sing beyond mankind. And that poem, the title of that poem, Thread Suns, gives the title for the next volume called Fadensonnen, or Thread Suns. Now from that volume, I would like to read two poems, only in English, but I would like to read some of the commentary to show you how the commentaries work with the poems and how this works together. So, Celan, if he didn't write much essays, much poetics, except for two very important ones, did, however, in each of his books always embed some poems that were programmatic poems, that were poems that laid out his poetics. Here is one of those. Line the word caves with panther skins, widen them, hide to and hide fro, send hither and sends thither. Give them courtyards, chambers, drop doors, and wildnesses, parietal, and listen for their second, and each time second and second tone. So let me read a bit from the intro. I used this poem in the introduction to explain a bit about Celan's poetry. So let me read you a page from the introduction where I speak to that poem. Now, following Celan's own suggestion, I already, earlier in the book, insisted on the importance of the word in the late poetry. This poem that you just heard thematically foregrounds this point, yielding insights not only into Celan's writing process, but also into the reading process. The work of poetry is to be done on the word itself, the word that is presented here as a hollow, as a cave, an image that suggests immediately a range of connections with similar topoi throughout the oeuvre, from prehistoric caves to Etruscan tombs. The word is not solid, nothing diorite or opaque, but a formation with its own internal complexities and crevices, closer to a geode, to extend the petrological imagery so predominant in the work from Brestern on. And in the context of the first stanza, however, the panther skins seem to point more towards the image of a prehistoric cave, at least temporarily, for the later stanzas retroactively changed his reading, giving it the multi-perspectivity so pervasive in all the late work. Now, these words need to be worked, transformed, enriched in order to become meaningful for the poet and then for the reader too. Works both ways. In this case, the poem commands the poet to line them with animal skins, suggesting that something usually considered as an external covering is brought inside and turned inside out. The geometry of this inversion makes for an ambiguous space, like that of a Klein bottle, where inside and outside become indeterminable or interchangeable. These skins, pelts, hides, or furs also seem to be situated between something, to constitute a border of some sort. For the next stanza asks for the caves to be enlarged in at least two, if not four directions, hide to and hide fro, sends hither and sends thither. This condition of being between is indeed inscribed in the animal chosen by Celan via a multilingual pun. Though he wrote in German, of course. Celan lived in Paris, in France, and spoke French every day. His wife was French. He translated from French. He, by the way, if you read his letters to his wife, he is as good a writer in French than anybody, than Gide. His letter is a stylist of first order in French. Now, between in French is entre, E-N-T-R-E, while the homophonic rhyme word entre with an A, A-N-T-R-E, refers to, means a cave. So this entre, this cave, by the way, is paragrammatically inscribed in the animal, in the panther, right? You have the entre somewhere in there, hiding inside that, you know. And you could, of course, pursue that panther image and go all the way to Rilke, and a very famous panther there, and Celan was somebody who liked Rilke very much. So that is, you know, one of the ways of getting out of the poem and into the world, from what you said earlier, you know, on how to read. Now, unhappily, the English word line, the word caves, is not able to render the further play on words rooted in the ambiguity of the German auskleiden, which means to line, to drape, to dress with, but also its opposite, to undress, right? So that is something that I was unable to get into that line, you know, line the word caves, impossible. Now, those Worthöhlen, in a way, there's a further echo of inversion there, and they call to mind the expression hohle Worte, empty words. And you say there Worte, not Wörter, which is a different plural of the thing. So all of this kind of thing resonate there. Words and language as such have been debased, emptied of meaning. This is one of the core of Celan's work, you know, via the Nazi years. And the words have to be recreated, have to be given a new load, newly charged, so on. Now, the third stanza adds another stratum to the concept of Worthöhlen by introducing physiological terminology, linking the word caves to the hollow organ that is the heart, right? So these physiological topoi appear with great frequency in the late books. And there's a transfer of anatomical concepts and terminology, and specifically in this poem, how the heart's atria become the poem's courtyards, the ventricles chambers, and the valves drop doors. The poem's you, as behooves a programmatic text, is the poet exhorting himself to widen the possibilities of writing by adding attributes, by enriching the original word caves. Now, I can actually go on for another 2 pages on this, but let me just sum up a final note here on it. Giving the heart imagery, when you come to the last stanza, listen for their second and each time second and second tone, you immediately think that you listen to the tone of the heart, you listen to the systole diastole movement, right? That is there. And now the systole corresponds to the contraction of the heart muscle when the blood is pumped through the heart and into the arteries, while the diastole represents the period between 2 contractions of the heart when the chambers widen and fill with blood. And the triple repetition on the need to listen to the second tone thus insists that the sound produced by the diastole is what interests the poet, right? That movement. So one could go on with that, but I'll go to another, a slightly earlier poem in here to do a similar quick operation. After that, I will just read some more, okay? But I think is it useful to talk a bit about what the poems do. Out of angel matter, on the day of the ensouling, phallically united in the one, he, the enlivening just, slept you towards me, sister, upward, streaming through the channels, up into the root crown. Parted, she hoists us up, equal eternal, with standing brain, a bolt of lightning, sows our skulls aright, the pans and all the still to be the cement bones, strewn from the east to be harvested in the west, equal eternal, where the script burns after the 3/4 death, before the rolling around remainder soul, which withers in crowned fear, since ever. Now, if I go to the commentaries in the back. Where is the Höhle here? Must be the page before. So the poem Aus Engelsmatiere, Out of Angel Matter, was written May 1st and May 2nd, 1967. Celan always noted the dates on the poems when he wrote them, but he took them out when the poems came into volumes. So I have added them back again in the commentaries because it's very useful to know exactly. You can also see the sequences. In this case, May 1st to 2nd, 67, and we also know that during that first week of May, Celan was reading Gershom Scholem's On the Mystical Shape of the Godhead. Now this poem too can be read as a mystical commentary, the erotic component being assimilated to the Unio Mystica and to Schwester, the sister in the poem, to the Shekinah. And then I give a list of poems you can compare this to throughout the work. The philosopher Otto Pögler also points to Jewish mysticism in relation to this poem and writes, according to ancient teachings, the emanations of the divine Urground are made of an especially sublime matter, the same as the matter angels are made of. Here, the enlivening just, der belebend Gerechte, living according to the Zohar, with the Shekinah, slipping it towards mankind and thus also towards the poet. And you can trace the enlivening just in Scholem. You can trace a lot of the original thinking and even of the terminology to Scholem. So of course it becomes something else in the Celan poem. But I think it is good to know, the various origins. I mean, one reads a poem to find another book to read. So you never run out of books. Very important. Voila. Now, so that is the commentaries, and they are, putting together. So how are we doing time-wise? We're good. Okay. I'll read on without commentaries from various of the later volumes. I'll start by a famous poem, which is the poem he wrote on the visit to Heidegger's, the poem Todtnauberg, on which, and you can find it online at the EPC in Buffalo, I wrote a 30-page essay about translating that poem and about what the poem is about. Todtnauberg was, of course, the place where Heidegger had his Hütte, and of course the word Tod also, it doesn't mean that, but it obviously sounds with the notion of death in there. Todtnauberg, Arnika, and in the first stanza you're going to come across a Sternwürfel, a star die. There it is. People have done a lot of thinking about it, where it came from, but if you find that picture of Heidegger in front of his fountain, you see the wooden star die on top of... So it is explained immediately via... Celan was very much, I wouldn't say an objectivist, but his references are totally there. He's accurate. He doesn't invent things. Arnika, eye bright, the draught from the well with the star die on top. In the Hütte, written in the book, whose name did it record before mine? In this book, the line about a hope today for a thinker's word to come in the heart, forest sward, unleveled, orchids and orchids singly, raw exchanges later while driving clearly. He who drives us, the Mensch, he also hears it, the half-trod log trails on the high moor, humidity, much. And yes, it is a formidable poem that has often been misread, by Gadamer, for example. Let me go to the next volume and read a couple poems. The next volume is Light Duress. Read a couple poems from it. Strew ochre into my eyes. You no longer live there. Safe on the tomb furnishings, safe. Pace off the stone rows on your hands. with their dream, paint over the stamped out temporal bones squammer. At the great bifurcation, recount yourself to the other 3 times, 9 times. He is sarcastic. There is some humor, some very harsh humor and sarcasm in his work. Leap centuries, leap seconds, leap birth, Novembering, leap death, stocked in honeycomb troughs, bits on chips, the Menorah poem from Berlin, unasylumd, unarchived, uncared for, alive, reading stations in the late word, dotted pilot lights line the sky, crest lines under fire, feelings, frost spindled, cold start with hemoglobin. And a bit further on, here's a poem where he shows his multilingualness. He was, of course, a very multilingual poet and coming from a town that was multilingual. You be like you always. Stand up, Jerusalem, in the Heftig. Even he who cut the band with you, in de wird erluchtet. Tidied anew in the Gehooknis, mudclots I swallowed in the tower, language, dark pilaster strip, Kumi Ori. So those lines there, stand up, Jerusalem, are Middle High German from Isaiah 6:1, and they're basically translated in the version that we like best of the 17th century Bible version in English, as arise, shine, for the light is near. Gehooknis is also a Middle High German term for memory. So it is Hooknis, and Celan transforms it immediately, Germanizes it by making it a Gehooknis. Kumi Ori is the arise and shine in Hebrew. And this is part, that arising, that shining. There is another poem from his moment in Jerusalem I want to read to you that again plays with that image. It stood on your lip, the fig splinter. It stood around us, Jerusalem. It stood above the Daneship, the bright pine scent. We thanked it. It stood in you. So that whole standing, that Kumiori, very important. There's also a wonderful humorous trait to that. His last lover, Elena Shmuley, was interviewed 2 years before she died, that's a couple of years back, and asked, about Celan and so on. Among everything she said was one line, it was very interesting. She said, and all the German departments in the world are looking for what he means with Kumiori. He was so happy that an anatomical part of his stood erect again. So there is also that in Celan. There is the plain sexual right there. Okay, let me go to Timestead, the last volume, read a few poems from there, then close the reading with a few poems. It was the very last poems he wrote. Nomad Forb, you catch yourself, one of the speeches. The forsworn Astor joins up. Should someone who shattered the song speak to the rod now, his and everyone's blinding wouldn't happen. Spiteful moons sprawl and slobber behind nothingness. Competent hope, the half of it, switches itself off. Blue light now, blue tight in bags. Misery, flambéed in hot troughs. A throwstone game saves the foreheads. You roll the altars time inward. Gold that extends the Nubian back of a hand, the way, then the footpath toward you, on over the stone, the beveled one, from dream withdrawal times. two sand clods, wind-blown, stand with me. Star-infested moor wraps itself around one of the pines. The choir of plane tree trunks kowtows ready for the prayer against prayer. From sealed driftwood, I build names for you, which you peg close to the rain schemes. The war crickets shall come out of my beard. In front of the thought guilds already stands the tear. And the last poems that we have that were in the last manuscript published posthumously, and we know from the dates on it they were the last poems that he wrote. The world, just in all its thoughts. I, with you, you shaved bald. What bitters herein? The great alonenesses dwarfing in the auditory cortex him. Blessedly, the thumb screws whisper in sanguine rack torture height. The determining pauses are granted access. In the counting chamber, rebellious, the rings worship the rest. The lowered god thumbs, in bark shirt I haul in the lowest tree creepers. Soon it will be today, forever. The markings, the radiation brood, come a-dancing across the antimatter toward you into the comet conservatory. Vine growers, dig up, dig under the dark-houred watch, depth for depth. You read, the invisible one commands the wind to stay in bounds. You read, the open ones carry the stone behind the eye. It recognizes you on a Sabbath. But we let the last word to Celan.
Was hab ich getan? Die Nacht besamt, als könnte es noch andere geben, nächtiger als diese. Vogelflug, Steinflug, 1000 beschriebene Bahnen, Blicke geraubt und gepflückt, das Meer gekostet, vertrunken, verträumt. Eine Stunde seelenverfinstert, die nächste ein Herbstlicht dargebracht, einem blinden Gefühl, das des Wegs kam. Andere, viele, ortlos und schwer aus sich selbst, erblickt und umgangen. Findlinge, Sterne, schwarz und voll Sprache, benannt nach zerschwiegenem Schwur. Und einmal, wann, auch dies ist vergessen, den Widerhaken gefühlt, wo der Puls den Gegentakt wagte.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and moving. And I would be really interested, because I'm German, if your commentaries will be available in German as well, because I think they might be very useful for any German scholar.
Oh, it's an interesting question. At this point, there is no plan, but if you take Barbara Wiedemann's edition of the poems in one volume, she has very, very extensive commentaries. My commentaries, there is maybe a bit more. I mean, I take a lot from her. I take a lot from other commentators. I take what I have found out over the years. So it is there. But the German commented edition by Barbara Wiedemann is excellent. So for the time being, certainly. I mean, I don't know if somebody would want to do that, but it would be an interesting thing to have that.
Again, very impressive. Thank you. I was very intrigued by the drawing that you have on the front cover and what's underneath it, which is, I think, Je maintiendrai.
Yes.
And
yes.
it's November '64. And a lot of what you said, there was a lot of November in what you talked about. Just wonder if all these things tie together.
Not very consciously, we had the 1st of December, so we actually came right out of it. But yes, the cover is, of course, by Gisèle Ceylan-Lestrange, who, as an artist, was very close to Celan's work, and they collaborated often in the sense that Celan named most of her etchings, gave them names. That specific one I choose because Celan it's the only one where Celan wrote something on it. And he wrote, Je maintiendrai. And again, this goes to that notion of verticality, of standing up, you know. I will keep going, really, Je maintiendrai, which is kind of very powerful, you know, said, of course, because he then gave himself horizontally over to the water. November is, it happens in the poems too, is a hard month. You know, it's the memory of the dead. And Celan, certainly we didn't touch on that, but, you know, the experience of his parents' death in German work camps, they were actually Romanian Nazi work camps, was core to his life experience. So the memory of Khorban, as I like to call it, in Rothenberg's term rather than Shoah, was certainly very closely an essential part of Celan. Although his work was always wanted to go elsewhere. He was the one who did not speak of the events of the Shoah of Khorban ever, you know, and he refused to speak of it. He really wanted to move on and create something else. So, but November is a month of major sadnesses, indeed.
Hello, Pierre. Thank you for that. You have, of course, written a lot about your own nomadic poetics and writing in and out of languages and between them and at the fault lines between them, and have like yourself a kind of linguistically peripatetic trajectory. How do you reconcile that with Celan's assertion that one should write only in the mother tongue? I mean, perhaps you don't need to reconcile that at all, but I'm just interested to hear a little more about that.
Well, I think Celan had to say that, because the only language he had, I mean, the memorial he set was for his mother, and his mother was the one who had told him that High German and High German culture, that was the language, that was things. So at home, they spoke High German because the mother insisted. You hear him speaking German. Now, the normal German in Czernowitz was a much more Austrian, much more inflected, sung kind of structure. At the same time, he spoke Romanian, and he spoke Russian in those years there. Those languages were totally close to him. His father, who worked as a makler, was selling wood at the market, was probably also speaking Yiddish a lot, because Czernowitz at that time was can't remember, 60 to 80% Jewish town. So he was then he went to, he picked up French a bit, and he went to France to medical school for 1 year. And when he came back, he couldn't go back because the border was closed because of the war. So then he signed up with the university. Rather than studying medicine, he went into literature, and he studied English literature. So then he went into the English language. He wrote a few poems in Romanian early, but clearly his mother's. The complexity there is that German is the mother's tongue and the tongue of those who murdered the mother. So that doubleness, you know, kind of makes for the absoluteness of that statement he had to make, you know. Of course, his German is an invented language. What he writes in is a language he made up. I mean, if you look at all the words, that the combi words, the combined words, you read, oh yeah, this is a normal German word. You look in the dictionary, the word doesn't exist, right? Oh, he's made it up. Then there is one very complex, and you say, wow, I'll never find this. You look at that, and that one existed, right? So it is a very complex way in which he works, and he has all the other languages in it. Little work has been done, for example, his great love of Russian. You know, he was a wonderful translator of Osip Mandelstam, and Mandelstam was the brother, really. And I'm sure that there's a little bit on it, but in Russian, so I can't read it. But there is a Russian subtext, grammatically, or in some level, you know, that Russian enters the language. Just as French, simply because he lived in it for the last 22 years of his life, somewhere enters. And my nomadic sense is certainly there in his, you know, his language does do that, you know, is nomadic, moves. He creates another a new language.
In this connection, thank you very much for these terrific translations. In this connection with language, I wonder about that Heidegger poem that he wrote. You didn't talk much about it, referring to your commentary, I guess. But since I haven't read it, I would be grateful if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, quickly, if you look at the poem, look at the vowel, do a Robert Duncan on it, the vowel play. Arnika, Eyebright, Augentrost, 2 A's, bright A's, there's hope as he comes into the place, right? All of a sudden, the two men go for a walk, it becomes orchis and orchis, the male orchis that links to horde, to testicle, but it's the O, the dark O, right? And then the core word for me in there is Waldvasen, 2 dark A's all of a sudden, which is where they walk. Normally you would find the word Waldwiesen, that is, you know, happy meadows, you know, where you know, the shepherds, you know, play around with the lambs and so on. You know, think of English romantic poetry, what the glen means. And the man who translated the poem as it appears in Gadamer's essay for Heidegger, where he says, look, even Paul Celan, the Jewish poet, went to Heidegger because he recognized in Heidegger the greatest philosopher we have. Of course, had to translate it as meadows, as forest glens, you know. And in fact, if you go to the dictionary and you look at Vasen, what Vasen means, you immediately get somewhere else. Vasen is under the ground. It's the torf. It's the root work underneath. It then gets to the Schindanger, that is connected to the place where the dead animals are buried, you know. And when you go further, and I use only Celan's dictionary, that is the Grimm Wörterbuch, you know, the great, which was the core book for Celan, and you trace the Vasen further, you come to a dialectical North German meaning where it means the little wood you pick up in the forest and you take home to burn. And there the Vasen comes from the French word faisceau, which is the Latin word fasces, which is the bundle of rods with the axe translated. So, dung, 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 you go into the words in Celan, and you never know where you come out, you know, but very clearly here, the Waldvasen makes a reference to fascism, I think. That was in 2 minutes.
A quick one from a translator's perspective. when you were reading the first part of Du Darfst, the first poem in the Atemkristall cycle, you had said you may serve me with snow, or you may confidently serve me with snow. And if I recall correctly, the translation that you did for Sun and Moon was, you may confidently regale me with snow. And then if I recall the Hamburger, I remember you may safely regale me with snow, not even confidently. So I remember in my translation of that poem, I had gone with safely and regale. But I was worried, I was not worried, but I was intrigued by how in your process of revising, how it became from regaling to serving.
Over 45 years, I can't tell you exactly when and how I changed it, but I changed it a couple times. The way I translated it, I always translate as literally as possible. I mean, I want to write the German poem in English, you know, if I could do that, you know, the way Hölderlin wrote Greek in German in his translations, that sense, you know. In 76, I moved to Algeria. And in Algeria, I had a lot of time, and I took the 69 version of Atemwende and said, oh, this is too tight. Let me do a more open, a more flowing translation of it. So I retranslated it more flowingly. When I got back to Europe in 79, I kind of began looking at it again, said, no, I'm going back. When I prepared it, in fact, later in the 80s for saying, no, I'm going back more to the first one. Meanwhile, little words like that had changed. In fact, in the full show that Nicole and I did on this, we use a picture of that poem in my 1969 Bard College dissertation, and where I think it is again another word. I can't remember. So I can't tell you why. Listen, reading today the book to prepare for tonight, I came across 3 words that in the next edition I might change. I mean, translation in that sense is a live thing, you know. A poem is a live thing because every time you read, you say, oh, there is something else that I didn't get in there. That great word we just talked about, Waldvasen, there is no way of getting that in English, so I use the same word that Michael Hamburger finally used, is sword, S-W-A-R-D. At least it's had a certain darkness, and you have the sword as a weapon that kind of sounds in there, you know. But one is never satisfied, but that is great because it means you can always go back and then some. May 1,000 translations bloom is the other one. All right. You know it all now, no more questions.